Good day and welcome to Big Bad Tech. I'm your instructor, Jim Pytel, and today's topic of discussion is wind turbine yaw and rotor braking systems. Our objective is to examine the yaw and rotor hydraulic braking systems found in a modern industrial wind turbine. We'll discuss the purpose of these two important systems, as well as examine a representative schematic, explore the general operational principle, and discuss emergency backup operation. A couple housekeeping notes before we begin regarding the necessary qualifications for success and the limited scope of this lecture. 1. This lecture presumes the viewer has a working understanding of hydraulics, as presented in the Hydraulics playlist, available at the Big Bad Tech channel. Now, I understand some time may have passed since your hydraulics class and now, so if you're a little rusty on any of these topics or feel a little overwhelmed, don't worry, I got you. Because as specific subjects come up in the course of this discussion, I'll try to point you to the correct lecture that explores that specific topic of interest in greater detail. 2. This lecture discusses only the yaw and rotor hydraulic braking systems and not the hydraulic pitch mechanisms found on some hydraulically pitched wind turbines. A later lecture will examine hydraulic pitching mechanisms in greater detail. 3. There exists a thick, tangled jungle of technical oddities, especially for shoddy wind turbines made by shoddy manufacturers in shoddy countries. I'm looking at you, Denmark. And it'd be logistically impossible and perhaps legally irresponsible for me to explore the secret inner workings of the proprietary schematics for each and every wind turbine configuration that has ever been and ever will be constructed. In the interest of forward progress, this lecture therefore consciously limits itself to a simplified representation of a yaw and rotor hydraulic braking system. Additionally, I'll be discussing decisions made by the controller in very general terms only and not examine program specifics. This being said, you should find some commonalities between the simplified yaw and rotor braking system and controller as presented in this lecture and most modern industrial wind turbines. Long story short, always consult the operations manual for the specific turbine of interest. Lastly, related to the above qualification, it needs to be said that an important philosophical difference exists between different wind turbine manufacturers when presented the following question. What is the preferred state of a turbine when de-energized? Is a turbine's innate default state to spin freely and only actively lock it in place when commanded to do so? Or is it safer to lock it in place and only let it spin when commanded to do so? One can make solid arguments for both cases depending upon design philosophy. I am largely agnostic about either implementation, but in the interest of efficient forward movement, I've arbitrarily chosen to represent this system as a lock-it-in-place variety. This type of system, when de-energized, should hold a wind turbine in place, and only when commanded to do so, let it spin. Be aware that other types of braking systems may exist and behave fundamentally different than is illustrated in this lecture. Again, always consult the operations manual for the specific turbine of interest. Let us begin. As you are no doubt aware, the yaw system on an industrial wind turbine rotates the nacelle relative to the tower and actively seeks to maximize the surface area of the rotor exposed to moving wind. Once yawed into an appropriate position, the yaw system de-energizes the yaw motors and applies the yaw brakes to fix and hold the nacelle relative to the tower. If wind direction shifts, the yaw brakes are released and the yaw motors energized until the nacelle again faces into the wind. Smaller turbines may not warrant the inclusion of hydraulic brakes and instead rely upon spring-applied, electrically released friction brakes mounted right on the motors. You'll recall we examined spring-applied or electrically released friction brakes extensively in the motor control playlist. As a summary of the operation, when the M contactor closes, not only does it energize the yaw motor, it releases the friction brake. Conversely, when the M contactor opens, it de-energizes the yaw motor and a spring applies the friction brake. As functional as these devices may be, as turbines have grown in size, a significant number have adopted hydraulic yaw brakes as a reflection of their increased mass. This necessitates coordination between the yaw motors and the hydraulic brakes. When it becomes necessary to yaw the nacelle from one position to another, the yaw system releases the hydraulic brakes, confirms that they're released, and then energizes the yaw motors to turn the nacelle into the wind. Once the nacelle arrives in the designated position, it de-energizes the yaw motors and applies the hydraulic yaw brakes to fix and hold the nacelle in place. The rotor brake, in contrast, is selectively applied at appropriate times to hold an already decelerated rotor in position or released to allow the rotor to spin. Note the qualifier, already decelerated rotor. This means the primary purpose of the rotor brake is not deceleration, but rather holding an already decelerated rotor in place. The primary means of decelerating a spinning rotor is actually performed via aerodynamic braking, which pitches the blades at 90 degrees, thereby changing the shape of the airfoil, dramatically reducing lift. An aerodynamically braked turbine rotor rapidly decelerates, and when it reaches a rest state, the rotor brake can be applied to lock the rotor in place. This being said, with some added functionality, the rotor brake can be used as a soft brake or an emergency brake to decelerate a moving rotor below a certain speed prior to locking it in place, as we'll demonstrate in this lecture. When first presented the full hydraulic schematic of a wind turbine, especially one using hydraulically pitched blades, your initial instinct might be to recoil in fear at the sheer number of paths snaking left, right, up, down, in, out, and the dizzying number of components seemingly connected to every corner, bend, T-junction, four-way stop, and straightaway. Now, I just told you I wasn't going to use a real schematic for a real turbine and would restrict this lecture to a simplified representation of a smaller subsystem, but when have I ever been consistent or prone to telling the truth? Take a look at this. It looks like an octopus eating a plate of spaghetti inside a grocery bag half full of half-built Legos. What is going on here? Hold on now, don't pass out. Take a step back and take a look at the big picture. I've purposely used poor resolution in this diagram for two important reasons. One, it'll prevent me from being held liable for leaking corporate secrets and remain unanswered the means by which I acquired this proprietary document. And two, I don't want you looking at the details because I want you to step back and look at the big picture. What do you see? What I see is three big blocks of gobbledygook that kind of look similar to one another. Stacked on top of a wide thing in the upper middle, stacked on top of a little thing in the lower middle, and another block of gobbledygook on the bottom. Think about how a wind turbine is constructed. Three blades and a central hub make a rotating rotor attached to a stationary nacelle. What are the three identical blocks on the top? Most likely these are the three identical pitch systems for the three blades attached to the hub. Ignore these subsystems for now. We'll examine hydraulic pitch systems in another lecture. What's the wide thing in the upper middle connected to the three blades in the hub? Most likely that is the hub. It's probably some form of distribution system. Ignore this too. What's this smaller thing in the lower middle? It looks like it's something feeding the rotating hub from the stationary nacelle. What's the name of the hydraulic component that couples a stationary member to a rotating member? Oh yeah, it's a rotating hydraulic coupling. Ignore that too. What's this bigger block at the bottom? Most likely that's all the hydraulic components housed in the nacelle, principally the hydraulic power unit, the yaw braking mechanism, and the rotor brake, and all the valves and accessory components that make these subsystems work properly. When you lop off the branches of least concern, this lower block of gobbledygook is where we'd most likely find the systems of interest for today's lecture, the yaw and rotor brake. Long story short, don't drag a 10-foot pine tree around with limbs and roots attached when you want to look at a pine cone in the bottom branch. Just find the bottom branch. Now, find the pine cone in the bottom branch. Sharp-eyed viewers might notice three single-acting cylinders in parallel on the upper right-hand side. These are most likely the rotor brake cylinders, and the accessory valves controlling their function might be in close proximity. Where's the yaw brakes? Chances are this particular turbine doesn't use hydraulically driven yaw brakes because it's an older, smaller model that doesn't warrant this level of stopping power and instead makes use of spring-applied, electrically released friction brakes mounted on the yaw motors. What two clues led me to this conclusion? One, there's only one set of braking cylinders. If you've got a rotor brake and a yaw brake, you'd have two sets of independently driven hydraulic actuators. You'd additionally have more valves independently driving each system because sometimes you want the rotor brake applied and the yaw brake released or vice versa. Two, the other subtle giveaway that this is a smaller turbine not warranting the inclusion of hydraulically driven yaw brakes is the fact that inside each hydraulically pitched blade system, I'm only seeing one double-acting cylinder. As modern turbines have steadily increased in size, their blades have also steadily increased in length, mass, and girth, such that it's not uncommon to now see a pair of double-acting cylinders acting in opposition to pitch the blades. If this was in fact a more massive turbine, we'd most likely see two double-acting cylinders in each pitch subsystem and another set of independently driven brake cylinders constituting yaw brakes and their associated valves controlling their function in close proximity in the nacelle hydraulics block. The moral of this story being, a complete hydraulic circuit might be a confusing, tangled mess, but it should be well within your capacity to at least determine the general location of a particular subsystem and those actuators, valves, and accessory components that control it. Once you get an idea of the general location of the smaller subsystem, you can start looking at that tiny subsystem in greater detail. Before doing so, it's probably worth a moment of our time to refresh our understanding of some basic hydraulic components you should be familiar with from your first-year hydraulics class, specifically hydraulic power units, valves, actuators, sensory apparatus like switches and sensors or transducers, and accessory energy storage and backup components like accumulators and hand pumps. Central to the proper operation of all hydraulic systems are those components that source flow and condition fluid. At a basic level, a hydraulic power unit, or HPU, consists of a motor prime mover, a pump, and a reservoir. The motor prime mover consumes electrical power and produces rotational mechanical power. Via a coupling intermediary, which allows the pair to be taken apart for repair and service, the pump converts the rotating mechanical power of the shaft to fluid power and routes pressurized flow throughout the system. The reservoir's principal purpose is to store fluid not in use and ensure the pump has a ready supply of oil available when required. Additionally, the reservoir serves to clean and cool oil before it's pumped back into the system. Additionally, most hydraulic power units include a pressure relief valve and a means of filtration, since they're essential to the safe and efficient operation of the larger system. A pressure relief valve is a normally closed valve that opens the low pressure path back to tank when flow in the circuit is otherwise blocked. In this capacity, a pressure relief valve limits the system maximum pressure and serves as an important safety device that prevents damage to the system and personnel. The hydraulic power unit will also most likely feature a return line filter, positioned such that any fluid routed through the system must go through the return line filter at low pressure prior to being emptied into the reservoir. The fluid in the reservoir is then allowed a chance to cool, settle out any remaining particles, and dissipate any entrained air before it's pumped back into the system. You note the schematic symbol for an HPU might show multiple reservoir symbols. This does not mean there are multiple reservoirs, but rather simplifies the illustration of a larger schematic and prevents working lines from crossing over one another. Finally, a hydraulic power unit can also include some ancillary or supporting elements, though not essential to the system, add some serious bling. Cool points go to hydraulic power units with integrated pressure gauges, heat exchangers like heaters and coolers, offline or kidney loop filtration units, and sensory apparatus like pressure and float or level switches and temperature sensors. More on these accessory components in a moment. Finally, a hydraulic power unit may also include lockout and tagout devices like shutoff valves or electrical shutoffs. In most circumstances, a majority, not all, of the valves and accessory components associated with yaw and rotor brake systems are mounted inside a manifold attached to the top of the hydraulic power unit. A manifold is a machined metal block into which internal passages are drilled such that cartridge valves screw or slip into passageways drilled into the manifold. This type of design configuration presents several advantages. The manifold is in effect a common circuit free of potential leaks associated with external plumbing, and the cartridge valves are compact and easily removed and replaced. As compact and efficient as this may be, looking at a manifold for the first time might seem like looking at a Star Wars droid with a bunch of confusing stuff sticking out of it. For this reason, it's a recommended practice to take a picture of the manifold from the left, right, top, bottom, front, and back, print out those pictures, then bust out your hydraulic schematic and go through and identify each and every valve or component in the schematic, find its physical location on the manifold, and label the picture. Slip these labeled photos into your smart book right next to the hydraulic schematic, so when the time comes to service a particular component, you'll be able to find it with relative ease. Somewhere on the manifold, there may exist one or more quick disconnect inspection ports that allow a technician to take a pressure reading at specific points in the hydraulic system using a portable manometer. To take a reading with a portable manometer, the inspection port cover is removed and the portable manometer inserted. When properly seated, the check valves in both the quick disconnect port and the manometer are pushed off their seats to allow pressure reading to be taken. It is incumbent upon any technician taking a pressure reading to cover the port after use to prevent contaminants from being introduced into the system. Moving on. Valves are fluid power components that modify flow rate, pressure, or direction of fluid in a system. A subset of these valves, directional control valves, as the name implies, stop, start, and change direction of fluid flow. Directional control valves have several identifiable features, notably positions, ports, and means of actuating, offsetting, centering, and/or overriding them. Ports are entry and exit points to a valve. This is a two-port valve. A position performs a particular function. This is a closed position that does not allow fluid flow from left to right. This is a straight-through position and does allow fluid flow from left to right. This is a two-position valve. Most valves have a natural resting state asserted by some accessory device like a spring offsetting it to one side or a pair of springs centering a three-position valve. This particular valve is spring offset to the closed position such that flow from left to right is blocked. One might consider this valve normally closed. Shifting a valve from one position to another moves internal components like poppets or spools to selectively connect or disconnect ports via the internal passageways machined into the valve body. Repositioning the movable components is known as the act of actuating the valve. Actuation methods include, but are not limited to, manual levers, electric solenoids, or pressure pilot signals. This valve is solenoid actuated. When the solenoid is energized, this valve shifts to the straight-through position and allows fluid flow from left to right. When the solenoid is de-energized, the spring offset returns the valve to the closed position and blocks fluid flow from left to right. Since there may be occasions in which the controller, electrical signals, conductors, or solenoids themselves may be damaged or non-responsive, certain directional control valves may offer a means of directly shifting the valve to the actuated position via a manual override. A manual override might take the form of a plunger that's pushed in or pulled out, a lever that's pulled up or pushed down, a screw that's screwed in or screwed out, or some other means that's diddled or dorked with, effectively forcing the valve into the activated position. The top hat symbol identifies this valve as having a manual override that can force the valve into the straight-through position and keep it there if the solenoid is ever out to lunch. In summary, this valve might be referred to as a two-port, two-position, solenoid-actuated normally closed valve with a manual override. In its deactivated state, the spring offsets it to the closed position, hence the name normally closed, such that it blocks flow. When the solenoid is energized or the manual override actuated, the valve shifts to the straight-through position and allows fluid flow. This is in contrast to a two-port, two-position solenoid-actuated normally open valve with a manual override which effectively exhibits the opposite behavior. In the deactivated position, the spring offsets it to the straight-through position, hence the name normally open, such that it allows fluid flow. When the solenoid is energized or the manual override actuated, the valve shifts to the closed position and blocks flow. Various combinations of ports, positions, and actuation methods make for a dizzying array of commercially available directional control valves. Moving on.